Everybody give some thought to the cut, plant, external rotation. Okay. Cut, plant. Now, think about this. If we were standing and the ground would report my body weight. If I just had a scale, it would say, 200 pounds. The only way I can get the scale to say more, maybe some of you did this like I did, not on a digital scale, but on like a needle moving scale. You kind of bounced on it, and then it would kind of go more and less, right? Because when you push on it, you're pushing with more than your weight, and the scale is going to show. Okay? Some of you may have played this trick on somebody who's getting their weight, and you go from behind it and step on it to add a few extra pounds, and they're just like, "What, dude? I thought I lost weight." Why do we do this? We do this because when it's time to change direction, we need our feet, shoes, whatever is on our feet to interlock, to compress with the ground with more force to make sure we don't slip or slide away while we go to change direction. Think of it like this. This is physics, but put into layman's terms. In football, we would get fussed at if we were just standing like this, right? Get in an athletic position, they used to say. That's layman's terms for put yourself in a position where when it's time to change direction or to go, you're in a position where you can push because your knees are flexed and your hips are flexed. You can push into the ground more than your weight, and that compression can help with the friction that's needed to change direction. If I was standing upright, I'd have to flex and flex first, then push, then move. But if I'm already flexed and flexed, I can push and go. So far, so bad? All right. So when we get into these cut and plants, the reason your knee is flexed so that you can push into the ground with more force than your weight, so that you can change direction. It is really hard to change direction in an athletic, competitive sense with straight legs. Right? So the flexion of the knee unlocks the knee so that you can use your hamstrings and your quad to push into the ground so that you can get more force perpendicular from that ground, either from friction or your cleats. Okay? So when we flex our knee, that's when our knee unlocks and we are allowed to have some knee rotation. And that knee rotation happens because every time we would cut and plant, if we didn't have it, we would rip up some knee ligaments. It's a little bit of give, some shock absorb, some sway. The illusion is that here, notice, patella, bless you, patella is like lined up with my toes. Patella, toes. Patella, come on, Cam. Getting old. Patella, toes. When I'm externally rotated at the knee, my toes are facing lateral to my patella. Does that make sense? So far, so bad. Lateral spin. So when I cut and plant, let's see if I can do this. When I cut and plant, my toes are facing lateral to my patella. So that is still lateral spin of the knee. It gets you to the same place. Remember the treadmill analogy? If I'm running to your left on a fixed ground movable meat, but if I'm running on a treadmill, wouldn't the treadmill belt be going that way? But yet I'm still running in the same direction. I'm running to your left. the same concept. It's not necessarily how any one bone is moving, it's how did the joint get to its new position relative to the two bones. From here, well, let me see if I can get up for the, trying to make it viewable for the 15 people that may want to watch this again. Here to there gets my knee in the same finished position as here to there. Now, I'm not saying there's not hip stuff or subtalar stuff. That's for a hip conversation or a subtalar conversation. We're just talking about the knee rotation. This new position is the exact same position as this position. And how would I have to move to go back to where I started? I'd have to internally rotate to go back home, which tells me I had to externally rotate when I left home. Okay. Any questions? All right, check this out. The ankle, knee, and hip are pretty unique. Bless you. It's a 4:15 exam day, and so we get to a little bit from those guys. All right, check this out. Ready, go. All right. This class is not about telling you how to lift. This class isn't here to tell you about proper technique. I'm just here to teach you how the body moves and how the body works. And then you learn how your philosophies want people to move or to. Some people believe in knees over toes. Just say it, like, just here to teach you how the body works, how the body moves, and then you take that information and go apply it infinitely many ways. What I want you to notice with this picture is during a weight-bearing closed chain squat, unless you're going to fall over, I have to keep my center of mass over my base of support. Hey, knees, just move by yourself. Hey, hips, just move by yourself. Hey, ankles, just move by yourself. Or, right? So the point is that to keep my center of mass over my feet, and to make my center of mass go up and down, primarily, it makes sense that your ankles, your knees, and your hips kind of have to work as a team right here. True? You got to coordinate muscles and movements. And so I wanted to show you, I think we can do this, how in this setting, the knee joint itself is really secondary to the ankle and the hip. What I mean by that is, the ankle joint is the tibia and the fibula is part of the ankle joint. And the femur is part of the hip joint. So the tibia is kind of already married, already accounted for, and so is the femur. And so if you have hip extension and ankle joint plantar flexion, the knee kind of has to move because of it. It's almost kind of like an illusion where the femur is moving proximally at the hip and the tibia is moving distally at the ankle, and so the knee kind of has to move because of these two other long bones that are kind of already committed on top and below. Why am I telling you this? Because of perspective of knee and hip rotation, that's why. So check this out. Let's see if I can do this. It's just different, and different is okay. What I have here are two very expensive coffee stir sticks that I borrowed to help prove a point. So in anatomical position, we're going to have bilateral axes. We're going to have sagittal axes. Harder one to show is polar because I can't exactly put it inside my body, right? So I'm just going to kind of show it like this, but you know it kind of does that, right? Easiest one to do is on the top of my head, but once I start to get inside the body, I can't exactly put it inside my body. All right. Here's what's happening. I have a polar axis that runs through my hip that can do this. I have a polar axis that runs through my knee, but in anatomical position, my knee cannot do this. Remember, the knee is locked into place. And last semester, I remember a student asked a very good question. He said, well, how is this not knee rotation? And I said, because it's an illusion. You may think your knee is rotating, but notice how my femur is going exactly with the tibia. So there's no differentiation. Going along for the ride. Show you what I mean. That both the tibia and the femur are both moving together. There's no knee rotation there. That's actually happening at the hip. And the counter to that is happening at the subtalar and transverse dorsal joints. We'll get into that later. So here is the lesson for today. When I flex my knee, I differentiate the polar axis. One is going to be for knee rotation, and that's going to be this one right here. That's going to pass through the distal femur, but go along the long axis of the tibia. Does everybody understand that? I'm going to do my best. When we flex our knee, we split two different polar axes. One is going to be representative of the knee joint, and that is this one. This is the knee joint polar axis. That's going to run through the distal femur, not along the femur, through the distal femur and pass through the long axis of the tibia, so that we can have lateral and medial rotation, so that we can have external and internal rotation. Boink, so that we can have boink, so that we can have yoink. Now, why is that? Well, because if this is the tibia and this is the femur, and rotation occurred about the long axis of the femur, about the knee, when our knee is flexed, we would have a bad day. We would literally be ripping ligaments if we did this. Does that make sense? So this axis that runs through the femur here and here is actually going to be assigned to hip rotation. internal, external, internal, external, external, internal, external, internal. So I'm explaining why our tibia is going to hold on to a local reference of transverse, and the femur will hold on to a different reference of a transverse. And that's because the femur cannot rotate about its long axis about the knees. You'd have a bad day. You'd literally dislocate your knees. But the tibia can. The tibia can rotate transversely about the knee, or the knee can rotate in the tibia's transverse plane about the tibia. Did that make things clearer or foggier? Why this is knee rotation, but not hip rotation? Because hip rotation is going to be this. Michael Jackson, it's going to be this stuff. Knee motion, hip motion, hip motion. So your instinct is to want to say, whoa, look at all of this stuff wanting to come in. That must be knee internal rotation. I'm explaining why your instinct wants to say internal. Because you got all of this stuff coming in as you cut and plant. But it's not about all this stuff. It's just about this stuff. And from here to there is the exact same motion at the knee as from here to there. Yes? Here, table's a blessing and a curse. Here to there is the same as here to there. Right knee external rotation. Questions? Okay? Let's go to the hip. You might think we're in the express lane, but it's actually going to make more sense when we can put everything together, when we can do examples. Because as I told you here, when you're weight bearing and closed chain, nothing's just happening by itself. Okay? Hip, triaxial, ball and socket. Let's practice some content understanding. Triaxial, how many planes can it move in at any given point in time? Good. How many axes can it move about at any given point in time? Good. How many motions will we have to? 6 motions at any given point in time. Outstanding. Get into that a little later. Unit 2. Whoa, I thought I posted lecture number 2. Oh, I'll make sure to do that. Yep. So Taylor, knee, hip. Yeah. So cool. Look, guys, I invented something. The penguin in the pelvis. Isn't that adorable? Yeah, all I did was just add 2 little eyes, but it like works so cute. The penguin in the pelvis, and it looks like he has a little crown too from the state. So he's a king penguin. All right, hip joint. What are the bones that articulate it? You have the fused ilium, ischium, and pubis. That's why I have a photo of that. You see the red, the yellow, and the green. Those are separate bones that are unfused when you're growing and develop so that they can grow above each other. And then when you stop growing, they get cemented, they get welded, they seal up, right? So they're not intended to move once they seal up, but those are three separate bones that have borders. It's like Texas and Mississippi don't move about each other, but they're two separate states. That kind of concept. So the socket is actually formed by three bones, three separate bones. And then the femur is the fourth bone that articulates. That's the ball inside the socket. So you have 4 bones on your right hip and you have 4 bones on your left hip. The femoral neck really is what stands, it makes the femur stand out significantly from the humerus. It's got to move like the humerus, but it has to weight bear a heck of a lot more, so that bone's going to be denser. It's going to be a lot thicker, and then it has to, I mentioned this last week, there's a trade-off in stability and mobility. What you gain in mobility, you're going to lose in stability. What you gain in stability, you're going to lose in mobility. Where are more injuries at? Shoulders or hips? Shoulders. You move a lot more in the shoulder. Your hip has so many defense structures for stability. First of all, the socket of the hip, big, deep, called the acetabulum. I like to think of it as like a meteor crater. Big acetabulum. The shoulder's acetabulum is a little golf tee. Right? The glenoid fossa is a little golf tee. It's still a socket. It's just like taking a rock and tossing it into the sand, making a little bit of crater versus a meteor making a crater. Still a socket, it's a little small socket. But the trade-off is that you have a heck of a lot more motion because of it. So big, thick socket, big, thick head of humerus or ball. And then, I feel like an infomercial, then you have this big, thick ligament inside the joint itself called Aries ligament. You don't have that in the shoulder because you need motion. Then on top of that, you have other ligaments like the Y ligament. Then you have these big, strong muscles that cross your hip joints. There's a lot of infrastructure put into stability at the hip. Why? Because back in the day, if you dislocated your hip, nice knowing you, Gramps. We got to remember, our ancestors didn't live in time of biomechanical wheelchairs and leg replacements and hip replacements. If you dislocated your hip, you were the limiting factor of our tribe or our community. Or another way to look at it, survival of the fittest. What do the alpha predators, who do they go after? The fittest animals or the youngest, the weakest, the hurtest, right? The hurtest, there's a new word. What I am saying is that it makes sense why we put so much effort into stabilizing our hips. Because if I dislocate my shoulder, I can still run away from danger. I can still get away. I can still move with the pack. But if I dislocate my hip, so I'm just saying we have a lot of stability here versus mobility up here. Same classification of joint. But the supplies that we put in the stabilization of the hip is far excessive than the stuff we do with the shoulder. All right, so let's get back to business. Another weird thing about the hips as compared to the shoulders. All right, check this out. Have an open mind. Ilium, ischium, pubis left side, ilium, ischium, pubis on right side. That is our lower extremities version of our scapula. Not the same thing, but it's our equivalent. Just like humerus is our upper extremities version of the femur. Tibia and fibula, lower extremity version of our radius and ulna. Okay. If you look at the silly penguin in the pelvis, I need you to note that because of the pubic symphysis in the front and the sacroiliac joint, that's where your fused sacrum articulates with the iliums on each side. The right and left side of the pelvis cannot move independently from the other side. What I mean by that is I could take my left scapula and totally move it independently of my right. But I can't do that in my pelvis. I can't take my right and lift it up like my scapula and my left side not do something, because they're not independent of each other. A better way to look at it is like that. Hey, right side, come up. The left side had to do something as well. Hey, right side, spin this way. The left side's like, I'm going with you. I can't independently rotate just my left one way and my right the other. Like, you can do this motion at the scapula, protraction. You can't do that at the pelvis. You can't take your pelvis and snap it and do this. Does that make sense? Okay. So the fact that your hip is made up of kind of this block of a pelvis will lend to a lot of potential illusions. We're going to get into the motions, we're going to get into that kind of stuff, but to me, I need to set you up for the illusions, because that's where most students miss questions. On the hip, because left side and right side are kind of tied in together, it's going to be difficult to just look at right hip motion when you got left stuff distracting you. Heck, I think we had a question like that on the last test. Because the pelvis, or the sockets, cannot move independently of each other when the socket itself moves about the ball. Now, when I'm just moving the ball, I can move my right hip by itself all day long. But when I move the socket about the ball, the left side has to go along for the ride. Does that make sense? Just the concept. That's like saying, use your imagination. I can just open the door by itself, no problem. But if I fix the door and move bourgeois, all of bourgeois has to move when I open and close that door. So right hip external rotation, when it looks like it's moving, and it is. Distal moves about proximal. But when I have the same motion, when I move the socket of the right side, the socket of the right side can't move without the whole pelvis moving. Everything, the whole building has to move. And the whole building has to move like this, or like this. I'm just giving you a heads up. That will mess with your mind unless you are prepared for it. Yes, ma'am.
I understand how they go through how you like stuff out. But to just work, but I don't understand, like whenever you just rotate your right side, external rotation, how is the left side moving?
It's not. Then if we're talking about the same thing, when I do this, my left side didn't go anywhere.
But I thought they came in.
When I'm moving the door, when I'm just moving the door by bourgeois, bourgeois doesn't have to move. It's when I move bourgeois by the door that the whole building has to move. So here, right hip external rotation, left side doesn't have to do anything. But when I move the socket about the ball, So the first one, here's the socket, here's the ball. I did this. Nothing on my left side had to go anywhere. But when I do this,
And that's the socket in the ground.
Mhm.
Okay.
yeah. And again, we're going to talk about what it's called. It's just the concept that my pelvis is almost, and it's not necessarily all the way fused, but for all intents and purposes, I cannot just move a right side socket without left side moving. And I'm not even saying joint motion. I'm just saying the left side of this block has to go along for the ride because they're not independent of each other like my scapula. I can move my right scapula. I can move my right upper extremity version of my pelvis independently than my left. I can't do that here. And one of the reasons, one of the biggest reasons, is that we have a skyscraper that starts from the pelvis that we call our vertebral column. I like to think of it as a skyscraper because there's floors, there's levels, and just like a normal skyscraper, you start dense because the bottom parts have to hold all that weight, and as you work your way up, you can get less and less dense because all my atlas has to do is hold the mass of my head. And what is the best surface to build a skyscraper on? Not soft, swampy ground, but hard bedrock. And that's what the sacrum is, a fused bedrock about which you could build a skyscraper on. So it makes sense we don't want the ground to independently move because the skyscraper would come crashing down. So I think the most elegant part of this is we get to have our cake and eat it too. We have a foundation, the pelvis, the sockets of our hips are not only a foundation for our upper extremity to eventually come about for us to be functional, but we can move our city because of our lower extremity to literally get up and move our city to wherever we need to go. It's kind of cool. Kind of cool. Now, why did this is so silly, but I think this works. See the little penguin in the pelvis? I asked my wife, I was like, what do you think of the penguin in the pelvis? She's like, you misspelled penguin. I'm like, damn it. So positive, so encouraging. Lucy K. Love. Because of some of these issues with triaxial joints that can move a lot, unlike more simple hinges where regardless of if I do this or this, both are going to see sagittal. I gave you, this is what this was about, guys. Both my knee, both my tibia and my femur are going to see the same sagittal. But man, when you start working in transverse, they don't have to see the same thing anymore. Tibia, femur. Now they both still see this, but they no longer see the same transverse. Because transverse plane is different. We hinted at it at the first couple weeks of class. You know, why do you think you have like flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, but the transverse stuff has like internal and external rotation? Like it's apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. It's a little different when you're talking about pure rotation. I have 50-pound dumbbells. You know what's not going to happen? This, nor this. But you know what can happen? This. It's a little different. So the purpose of this slide is to show you who owns the perspectives in the sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes of the hip joints and eventually the shoulder joints? The femur is going to own its transverse plane of motion. So internal and external rotation of the hip, we got to look at it from the femur's perspective, the long bone's perspective. The flexions, the extensions, the ab and the adductions, the sagittal and frontal is going to be owned by the socket's perspective of that relationship. It's no different than when you have a relationship, and I'm just going to give mine as an example. There's certain things that I do for the family, and there's more things that my wife does for the family. Paying the bills, checking the books, making sure we have money for food and stuff. I couldn't do that, even if I tried. That's just not my gift. In fact, if my wife was like, Brian, can you pay the bills? I would be like, I'd send one, I think it's my dyslexia, I'd send one check for the car note to the gas bill. I mean, it's hard for me to organize. But that's okay, because she knows what she does well, I know what I know well. It's very similar. The hip has a common goal of contributing to human movement. But we have to compartmentalize these perspectives so that this makes sense. Here's my pelvis, here's my socket's frontal plane, and here's my socket's sagittal plane, right? External, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal. Well, now I'm in my socket's frontal plane, but yet I'm still having the exact same movement of my femur. My femur is still spinning to its left and its right. Sorry, spinning laterally, spinning medially. External, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal. The reason the socket owns the sagittal and the frontal is so that this gets me more into fetal, even though my hip may be externally rotated and I do something like this. Campbell, what did you just do? Well, I did this, but I did it like this. In other words, inside of my leg, here's a better way to put it. Hip flexion, no problem. What if I externally rotated my hip? Would this still be hip flexion? I mean, my lower leg didn't do anything different. My femur did the exact same thing here as it did here. But does that look like flexion? Kind of looks like ab and adduction, right? So what that will allow us to do, not only understand movement, but for you eventual therapists, athletic trainers, we establish the hip position. So in other words, internally rotated and abducted, or abducted, or externally rotated and abducted. But if we did sagittal and frontal from the long bones perspective, like say my bicep dictated flexion, extension, abduction, all that stuff. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Does that make sense? So we have to establish these separate perspectives from each of the bones that make up these ball and sockets to give sense to all the different kind of movement possibilities they can do over a basic hinge. So the socket is going to own the flexion extension perspective and the ab and adduction perspective. I'm going to get into those motions and what they mean. And the long bone is going to own the rotational perspective. That doesn't mean you can't move the socket about the long bone. One of the hardest questions you're going to have on your second test is going to be this one, and it's in the book. But one of the hardest questions you're going to have is, I'm kneeling So here's my pelvis. The penguin is still facing forward. Does that make sense? My right hip is still an anatomical, it's just my left hip is flexed. And my pelvis is going to start to do this. The sockets are going to do this. And you're going to have to be able to say how this right hip is ab and adducting, but this left hip is internally and externally rotating. Because from here to there or here, when I move the socket, is the exact same motion as internal and external rotation. And that's how this comes full circle. This is the same as this to my left hip.
Did you get that in video or can we video? Okay.
That's in the video. I actually moved on purpose.
Okay.
So, should all this stuff make sense right now? Heck no. It shouldn't. But we have time and we have perspective. So that when I do go into the specific motions of the hip, and it looks like it's moving and it is, the easy stuff first. Got to make your 3-foot putts. But guys, this is what's coming. This is what's coming. This was left hip adduction. This was right hip abduction. This is what's coming. This was right hip ab, and this was nothing. This is what's coming. This was the left hip internal rotation, but your instinct is going to want to call it external. This is right hip internal rotation, but your instinct is going to want to call it external. And I find that the best way to prepare for all of those illusions coming is to kind of talk about why they're hard to see in the first place. Setting up these rules, setting up these perspectives, so that when we get into the specific motions, it'll be like, oh, I was ready for that. It's like game planning for an opponent that's coming. Cool? All right, guys, y'all have a good day.